had them online before I dial up. How they claiming they on top and I'm a mile up. I had them online before I dial up. How they claiming they on top and I'm a mile up. I know the wall's closing in, but don't you dare give up now. Poe believed in me, pull up through some bucks down. Todd told the valet pull the truck round. Push the line after we drew it, it's just us now. Would you believe me if I told you my granny told me she prayed this? Then booked the surgery just to pull me out of the basement. Right back where I started, nothing to show for a facelift. Got pushed playing Walter White and Davis, never felt so dangerous. The type of power they can't quantify. And name the best from my region, you gotta utter mine. Think of who really putting on, you never come to mind. Rapping like your Spotify, tap you rappers compromise. Yeah, no need to panic, just paint the canvas. If you can feel the static, you're too close, find your balance. Embed the revolution for they prohibition bandwidth. Blood trickle from the leaders he was planning. I had them all online before I dial up. How they claiming they on top and I'm a mile up.
We are live, folks. Hey, everybody. We're live, folks. Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. Apologize for the few technical difficulties we've been having, but we're really glad that you guys have joined us. This is Jackie Lukman.
Along with Baba Lukman, and good evening and welcome to this special edition of Coffee, Current Events, and Politics in Lukman Nation. Tonight, as we come to the end of 2020, we will discuss the major events and highlights that made this year a year to remember, such as COVID-19 and how the global pandemic exposed the weaknesses and failures of the capitalist system, Trump's impeachment, the election of Joe Biden, and the refusal of Donald Trump just to accept his defeat, Black Lives Matter, protests, George Floyd, the expanded surveillance state, and what it means as we enter a new year. Wow, what a list, right, Jack? That's just scratching the surface. But we're not going to be doing this by ourselves. So here to help us examine these and other issues are Ajama Baraka, who is the national organizer for Black Alliance for Peace, and Dr. Sharice Burton-Stelly, associate professor of Africano Studies at Carleton College, and the author of W.E.B. Du Bois, A Life in American History, and she is a visiting scholar with the Race and Capitalism Project at the University of Chicago. And last but not least, we have John Kiriakou, CIA whistleblower who exposed the use of torture by America's intelligence agency. He is also a former co-host of Radio Sputnik's Loud and Clear with Brian Becker. So we appreciate you all for joining us tonight, for which we believe will be an enlightening and entertaining and discussion. But before we begin, we'd like to remind everyone to hit the like button and subscribe button. Y'all know the drill. And share this video and invite your friends to join us here on Lukman Nation, the most dangerous show on social media, and we back that up. So as always, before we begin, Africa must be free.
I was about to say by 1983, like Ajamu said, because it's way overdue. We way overdue for Africa's freedom. But yes. Listen, we wanted to talk to people who we have a lot of esteem for and who we know are knowledgeable on one thing, and that's how to connect all of these issues together. That for a lot of people, from what we've seen in the past year, people don't think a lot of these issues are connected. They're like individually bad, awful things that the government has done on some degree, but people have not, we don't think, effectively connected these issues together, in particular in regard to the struggle for liberation here and around the world. And we're going to try to do that tonight, and I think that we got the right people to do it. So let's start off at the top of the year.
Why not?
Just the beginning of this year was absolutely, utterly ridiculous because of the continued Russiagate issue. And how do I want to ask this? Like, John, and I'm thinking of you in particular. Throughout the course of the year, we talked about on Loud and Clear and on By Any Means Necessary, we talked a lot about how Russiagate was just a complete farce from the 2000 from the election. I don't even know what year it is anymore.
The 2016 election.
2016. I want 2020 to be over so badly. I forgot what year it is. From the 2016 election, the whole Russiagate business it was such a farce, but it was so, it was bought and sold whole cloth by the Democratic Party and by the media establishment, the corporate media establishment, the so-called liberal media, and a lot of the conservative media too. And that bled over into 2020 in a lot of different ways. And I think one of those ways that we've seen that was the way activists were pulled into this 21st century McCarthyism, where people were accused of being Russian bots and Russian agents and all that kind of stuff. But I would love for you to recap the issues from Russiagate from 2016 and how they impacted, especially like the intelligence, the so-called intelligence community, and the way it interacted with the impeachment of Donald Trump early this year, and why the issues with the FBI were such a problem with that impeachment, and how that kind of bled over into the way activists were dragged into this McCarthyism, this McCarthyite dragnet, all connected to Russiagate.
Sorry, my sister's dogs are barking.
Oh, it's okay.
There is so much to say on this issue. Honestly, I'm not even sure where to begin. It seems, Jackie, as though even before this story broke, the Democrats decided that this was going to be their issue. Even before the public was really aware of what was going on, they were going to use this as a battle line to be drawn. And that's what they did. You know, we saw it on MSNBC, we saw it on CNN. Every story was Russia, that somehow the Russians had stolen the election for Donald Trump. Somehow the Russians had suppressed voter turnout in states like Ohio and Florida, and it just wasn't true. On Loud and Clear, I said a number of times that when I was at the CIA, I was taught that you couldn't make a judgment without evidence. You had to have evidence, and not just a single source telling you something. You had to have multiple sources. And so we said repeatedly on Loud and Clear, there was no evidence that any of this happened, but we waited patiently, like the rest of the country, for the Mueller report to come out. The Mueller report finally came out, and there was no evidence that any of it had ever happened. But in the interim, the media had already decided that this was going to be the issue. That regardless of what the Mueller report said, the Russians had indeed intervened on the side of Donald Trump. Now, we know that that's not true. We know that that never happened because we've read the Mueller report. But it doesn't matter because the media already took their stand. Now, what happened in 2020? Where the Democrats a year ago were calling Mitch McConnell Moscow Mitch and saying that Donald Trump was in the pay and under the control of Vladimir Putin. Now the Republicans are alleging that the Democratic Party is under the pay and control of the Chinese Communist Party. Right. It's moved to the realm of farce, where none of it even matters anymore because it's so outrageous. It's so ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. But most people, at least people who are members or followers of the two major parties, don't care.
But John, let me ask you a question, a follow-up question on this. Is the fact that it still persists even now. Here we are at the end of the year, and it seems that this whole Russiagate thing has morphed into now the Russian hacking. We just heard the story, about a couple of days ago, this major breach of different government systems by Russia. And so it seems to be, morphing into something really major. Not only the United States being attacked, but also the EU, systems in the EU being attacked. And there seems to be this worldwide assault, cyber assault, allegedly by Russia which when I first heard it, John, I said, man, this is like an act of war. My question is, who benefits? Because this has to be, why are we still, first of all, at the end of 2020, still dealing with this Russian boogeyman? But in the end, who is benefiting from this? Or what is benefiting from it?
Nobody's benefiting from it because there's no upside to it. First, let's look at it this way. You have to look at the government's language very, very closely. You have to look at the language that the FBI, the CIA, the Cyber Command released. They say that it's likely a Russian attack, or we have reason to believe that it was a Russian attack, or it was launched by someone with ties to the Kremlin. What does that mean? Well, I was in the CIA for 15 years. I know what those words mean. Those words mean we don't know who did it, but we're going to blame the Russians because they're the likeliest character here. But let's assume that the Russians did do it. So what? We do it all the time.
Yes.
And it's not just the Russians. It's the Russians, the Chinese, the Brits, the French, the Israelis, the Iranians. Everybody does it. This is a normal part of life. This is what countries do to one another. And now all of a sudden we've decided to jump up and down like our hair's on fire when it happens. Well, it's been happening since the 50s, since the 40s even. Why now all of a sudden it's an act of war? All of a sudden it's something that we need to, call up the reserves. When we do this kind of thing all the time, I think that it's just become a political boogeyman, a political cudgel that can be used to clobber opponents on one side or the other. I really don't think that it matters to anybody.
Now, speaking of governments attacking governments, Ajamu, recently we just heard Iran once again losing a nuclear scientist to what many believe is alleged Israeli activity, alleged Israeli assassination, of course, backed up by the United States. As we know that Benjamin Netanyahu has been having his own issues, but with his alignment with the Trump administration, I mean, the Trump administration was like Santa Claus to the Netanyahu administration, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Just more recently, recognizing Morocco as having sovereignty over Western Sahara, basically backing up colonialism, so much for freedom and democracy. And so we also know that that the Palestinian, the two-state solution for the Palestinians, with all of the giveaways that the Trump administration has given to the Benjamin Netanyahu regime, I like to call it regime. Ajamu, how does this all tie in? And as far as Iran goes, now we know that President-elect Biden said that he would like to re-enter the nuclear deal that President Obama before him had solidified with Iran. And of course, we know that Trump got us out of that. So, what do you see at play here, and what are the ripple effects throughout this region? And what does Biden? I know I'm putting a lot on your plate, but what is Biden looking at too in the coming years?
You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I was saying that I'm actually going to assume even more for my plate because I wanted to comment on the very important question you raised with John.
Okay.
Before I get to this other very complex set of questions, issues that you raised with the Middle East and Israel and everybody else, I think one way we have to think about and look at this Russiagate situation is you raise the question, in whose interest was it? I kind of think that it was a very successful exercise and that it did benefit the interests of the state, the interests of the neoliberal class that never relinquished complete control of the state. Even while Donald Trump sat in the White House. Because what it achieved was a conditioning process that uh, resulted in people accepting the media, um, taking on the responsibility of determining what would be so-called facts, and suggesting that not only would they identify certain facts, but that they would provide an interpretation of those facts, and that those things should not be questioned. It justified the big tech companies under the guise of public safety and upholding the integrity of the democratic process to engage in content censorship and for people to call for even more. It was a very, I think, one of the most frightening in some ways and effective ideological weapons unleashed on the U.S. population in many, many decades. So, the real winners and the interests that were advanced, in fact, was the state and the neoliberal politicians and the rulers in general. So, it's something we have to take a look at because it's going to be with us going forward because, they understand that we are in a battle of ideals. And they understand the precarious nature of this current situation with the almost veritable collapse of the U.S. economy, the deepening crisis of capital, both in the U.S. and globally, the social contradictions that this is in fact generating. And so they need to have some mechanisms in place, effective ones, to be able to manage and administer the society. And this ability to be able to impose a kind of ideological conformity on the people. Now that they have moved all of us to these social media platforms, to be able to then determine what will be the range of acceptable ideals and analysis, information, should be a troubling development for anybody who's concerned about trying to maintain some degree of space so that we can try to change consciousness. So I just wanted to say that first and hope we can come back to that because it's a very, very important
definitely
conversation. On the situation, this kind of is related to, what's happening with your question around what's happening with the Middle East and the policies of the U.S. administration vis-a-vis the Israeli state. Because again, we have a normalization of a relationship in which the Israeli state has been given a full advantage to be able to advance its interests, even when it's detrimental to the interests of the U.S. state, without any kind of opposition or even sometimes questioning. There was a time that U.S. politicians would pretend to want to put pressure on the Israeli state because they were expanding settlements and all of that. They were pushing the mythology of the fiction of this two-state solution. But all of that now is out the window. I mean, who cares about two states? It's all about it's all about supporting the Israeli state, no matter what kind of crime they may engage in, no matter what kind of crimes against humanity, no matter how many Palestinians they shoot and maim, how many houses they blow up. If you raise questions of the U.S. of the Israeli state, then you are opening yourself to the possibility of also being branded as a anti-Semite.
Right.
So all of these issues are connected because they are reflective of a certain kind of ideological orthodoxy that is now the new norm that all of us are supposed to adhere to. And if we don't, then basically we are opening ourselves up to the possible negative political consequences.
Now, Ajamu, I do want to go back to what you said at the beginning about the Russiagate hysteria, because Dr. Burton Stelly, you wrote a book about W.E.B. Du Bois, And we know, because, we do love our history over here in Lukman Nation. And, we understand that Du Bois was one of many black activists. I feel weird even calling Du Bois an activist. He was so much more than that. But he was one of many prominent black leaders who were advocating for black folks against, ultimately in his career, against capitalism, against this American exceptionalism and imperialism. And he was subjected to this communist Red Scare kind of attack, as was Paul Robeson and so many other black activists and other, labor activists. This was a common tactic in the history of struggle, liberation struggle, labor struggle in this country, for the government to accuse folks fighting to be free of being communists. And I'm wondering how you are seeing the way this Russiagate trope bloomed like this poisonous flower in 2020, almost exactly, just with a new digital forum, the way we have seen it play out in history.
Yeah, well, so the other interesting thing to note about the persecution of Du Bois is that he was indicted as a foreign agent of the USSR for peace activism, right? So when we think about anti-communism and when we think about red baiting, it is a way to censor and to undermine all different kinds of counter-hegemonic struggles, from internationalism to anti-imperialism to anti-colonialism to peace activism. And so when he was indicted, it was like as an agent of a foreign power. Everybody knew that tacitly this was the Soviet Union. And so we can see the ways in which, because Americans know nothing about history and as such can be manipulated to believe any old thing, there's no fundamental difference in the American imaginary between the USSR and current day Russia. Not least because anybody who offers any type of counterweight to the United States becomes the enemy, right? And anybody who takes on a quote unquote line that's consonant with the enemy of the United States becomes anti-American, un-American, subversive, and dangerous. And we also see the way in which this narration has operated in relationship to the uprisings that were happening starting, May 25th, because we heard this discourse of outside agitator. Mm-hmm. Outside agitator is very much akin ideologically to foreign inspired, right? Foreign inspired being that one is ultimately acting on behalf of a foreign power, whether it be that one shares any type of ideological resonance with, contemporarily, it's China or the USSR. Previously, it's basically any socialist or even non-aligned country. The interesting thing is the United States is supposed to be the arbiter of freedom and democracy, but the discourses that are disciplined as antithetical to U.S. national security, peace, right? Economic flourishing, mm-hmm. self-determination, sovereignty. Mm-hmm. And so even today, as we hear, we see the ways in which movements on the ground are being disciplined for making these very demands. And even as we see the ways in which people, as you were saying earlier, activists who are making particular types of demands or critiques are being construed as Russian bots. Again, as I said this line earlier, but as Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And the communism and the USSR, now Russia, has been this durable specter of destabilization and this durable specter of sort of counter-hegemonic or dangerous thought. And we continue to see that today, not least with this current sort of phantasmic Russian cyber attack.
I cannot help but remember, Ajamu, when I was offered the job at By Any Means Necessary, and remember I was like all nervous because I was a technical writer for a government contract, a civilian government contract for General Dynamics. Mm-hmm. And I got offered the job at Sputnik, and I was like belly aching to you, and you were just like, I don't know what your problem is. I don't understand what kind of decision you need to make, but I know you got to go through your process, so I'm just going to be here for when you finally make up your mind. And I called a couple people, and one of those people was Ajamu Baraka, because if anybody understood what the implications of me working for Sputnik News could be, it would be him. So, I mean, we had to have that talk, and I seriously had to have that thought process. We had to have that conversation. Mm-hmm. What happens if we're out here and we're doing what we love to do, and we are engaged in community activism and doing other things, and then we get tagged as Russian agents? And our decision was, oh well, that's just the way the cookie crumbles. That's you know, we'll deal with it when we got there. But I just wanted to give people a real life example. I mean, this was a real thing. This was not like, this wasn't like some esoteric conversation that people were having. Mm. You know, no, this happened to people. And since I worked at Sputnik, yes, people have called me a Russian bot. And
even unfriended you on Facebook.
Unfriended me on Facebook. A couple of my family members was like, Lord Jesus, you working for the Russians. And I'm like, well, they pay, so, you know. So, but you know what?
No, it's very serious.
It is.
Yeah, it is very serious. But Ajama, you also brought up the issue of the Middle East that has been an enormous issue for many reasons this year. And John, I want to circle back to you, because the so-called intelligence community has always, this whole, you know, radical Islamic terrorist business and this, you know, oversized, outsized threat to Israel that's always used to justify U.S. foreign policy and money going to not just Israel, but to clandestine operations that continue to keep Middle Eastern countries destabilized. And even though a lot of that part hasn't been as upfront and center in the news, I mean, has it ever really stopped? I mean, since the revolution in Iran in 1970, what was it,
78, 79.
Yeah, I mean, we think that because the media doesn't report, you know, the CIA or the NSA or you know, not the FBI, but, you know, all these secretive alphabet agencies, the news isn't reporting that they've got their fingers in other countries' affairs. But I mean, like you said, this is what we do all the time, and it's not just spying. Not we, the U.S. government does all the time, and it goes beyond just spying and hacking into networks. What is the extent of U.S. interference, in particular, in the Middle East, and how did it manifest itself this year that was really troubling?
Well, it's blanket coverage is what it is. I would call it interference. You just called it interference, and it's literally in every country in the Middle East, and not just the Middle East, but all over the world. I want to add first to something that Jamu said. Just today, the traitor Jonathan Pollard, who was working secretly on behalf of the Israeli government, was flown to Israel on a private jet owned by Sheldon Adelson after being released from federal prison, and was greeted at the airport by Benjamin Netanyahu. Let me add one very short anecdote. On my very first day at the CIA, January 1990, we were briefed by a handful of leaders, CIA leaders. It was all these 300 new employees in the CIA auditorium. One of those leaders that briefed us was the CIA's director of security. And he was explaining to us what other countries do when they're here in the United States. He said, you know, we're all focused on the KGB and the Chinese and the Cubans, etc. He said the Israelis, and mind you, this is 30-year-old information, 31-year-old information. The Israelis had 2 declared officers in their embassy. A declared officer is where the foreign government comes to us and says, these are two intelligence officers undercover as diplomats. They're here to work with you in a liaison relationship, right? There was one from Mossad and one from Shin Bet. And there were 189 undeclared Israeli intelligence officers scattered all across the United States to steal military secrets, right? Spying on U.S. defense contractors, spying on members of Congress, infiltrating think tanks, things like that. So imagine us doing that, but in every single country in the Middle East.
Wow.
And that's the relationship that we have with those countries. Now, we couch it in terms of a counterterrorism relationship now post 9/11. But really what it is just U.S. control of that country's foreign policy. It's no accident that Bahrain opened relations with the Israelis, that the United Arab Emirates opened relations, that Morocco opened relations, that the Sudanese are considering opening relations. It's because we're forcing them to do it.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, and I don't know which one to go to first, but I'm glad that you brought up the issue of Bahrain normalizing relations with Israel, because they weren't the only Arab nation to do that. And it seems like antithetical that an Arab nation would normalize relations with a country that is actively oppressing, abusing, and committing genocide against not just Palestinian Arabs, but also Palestinian Christians and other groups of people who are not Israeli, you understand, who are not citizens of Israel. But this goes farther than Arab nations moving toward this very weird kind of move. But Ajamu, I would like for you to explain why that's being done, and why some African nations are also normalizing ties with Israel, and what does it get any of them?
Well, that's a good question. I think that what we've seen is the consequences of power politics under a strongman regime under Donald Trump. And he had an agenda. The agenda was basically to take advantage of what appeared to be popular slippage for the Palestinian cause, and to rearrange or reconfigure the diplomatic relationships of many of these states with Israel. It was to facilitate the process of making it very, very difficult, even if the U.S. was to begin to gradually withdraw more from the region, for Israel to end up being isolated. So it is a complicated short-term strategy that it's not really going to result in, I think, what they're looking for, especially with the way in which international relations are moving, with the growing prominence of China, the moves being made by Russia, and the growing strength of a number of other states in the global south. But it is a very slick move in that, you are providing an opportunity for Israel to not only extend its diplomatic relationships, but also its economic relationships. And Israel has a long history on the African continent. We were just talking the other day about the fact that now you have Israeli investments across the continent. You have Israeli arms sales to various states on the continent. And Israel has been involved in training military forces and police forces on the continent. So, and we won't ever forget the fact that one of the strongest supporters of the apartheid regime in South Africa was, in fact, the Israeli state. So this is part of of Israel carrying out its particular interests, its particular foreign policies as part of the Western alliance. And so, we see how this unfolds as we go forward. But it is a very dangerous situation for many of these states that have made this move to align with Israel, because it's not getting a lot of press in the West, but many of these states have some serious internal political issues. They have. I mean, you mentioned Bahrain, for example. We have to remember that there was a very powerful pro-democracy movement in Bahrain that was violently suppressed by the Bahraini authorities with the assistance of the Saudis after a green light was given by the Obama administration. Mm-hmm. So, there's instability is something that's facing many of these same states that have strengthened their ties with Israel.
Now, Ajama, that you mentioned about the global politics too. Now, we're in this pandemic, and we're eventually going to get to this pandemic. But the pandemic, but with the pandemic, one of the things that has been very noticeable is the rise of China, or I would say the strengthening of China, and China's strengthening position on the global scene. The way that they dealt with the pandemic, as opposed to the way that that we've dealt with it, and the UK and many in Europe have dealt with it, China has came out of this, in my view, in a very powerful position. Now, with its Belt and Road Initiative and its own expansion into the Middle East and into Africa, do you feel what do you feel is the long-term implication? Because what you just explained about Israel and the Trump administration setting up these certain, what I guess they call blocks, in order to get these countries to recognize Israel as some sort of strategy. But and I imagine it's to oppose China and Russia's influence on the African continent. But you have AFRICOM, and those of us who are members of BAP, we know that those of us, we know that is a major issue for us. So where does this all play in? Because with all of these players coming together, we know that it's just going to further destabilize the relationship. And will that bring China and the United States closer and closer to confrontation?
That's a very good question. And those moves that are being made by the Chinese to strengthen their ability to ensure that they have access to the resources they need. The moves they've made with the recent agreement they made with the European Union to open up their economy to a certain extent to allow for European investment. All are moves being made to ensure that the intent of the Biden administration to try to reinvigorate the Western alliance to have a united front vis-a-vis China would be very difficult. And so, there are elements within, and I'm sure, John and others who are listening know, and that this is a dangerous development, because there are some elements in the foreign policy community that want a more aggressive stance vis-a-vis China. In fact, that was one of the main objectives of the Trump forces, and they were just, it took them a couple of years to sort of build a new consensus, because they were bogged down with this Russian nonsense. They wanted to make a pivot to China, from the very beginning, and they're under the illusion, I think, that they're going to be able to, create a united front that included the Western alliance and also Russia against the Chinese. So these are all, and we know that they identified the Chinese and Russia, of course, as major strategic competitors in their national security strategy. So these are very dangerous developments that could, in fact, lead to some kind of confrontation. But the Chinese are making moves to try to undermine that, of course, with that agreement and with this major agreement that occurred a few weeks ago with this regional comprehensive economic partnership, which is like the largest sort of free trade, they call it, agreement ever in the history of capitalism. So or in trade. So it's making it very, very difficult to do anything other than sort of a military confrontation between the U.S. and China, because the Chinese are playing the game that the Western capitalists say you're supposed to play, and the Europeans and the U.S. are being beat at that game. And so there's this move to try to use their imperialist power to try to contain China, including trying to entice them into a spending spree for military weapons. So it's a very dangerous situation, and I don't anticipate under a Biden administration for it to change much.
Well, I would like for us to pivot. We spend a lot of time on international, but I would like for us to pivot to domestic, because one of the things that COVID-19, and I would love for Dr. Stelly to chime in on this. One of the things that COVID-19 has shown is the blatant disparities that especially African people in this country and around the world suffered economically, socially, politically. That's the disparities in healthcare. But let's focus more on the United States, And we found out that one of the things that COVID done, that the pandemic has done, is exposed the inequities that we as Africans in this country have always known, and have always known that it was these inequities, and that the country always covered up. But what COVID did was just exposed it and realized that there was nothing that they couldn't cover this up, that there were disparities in health, education, the way that in political in the political arena. So, Dr. Stelly, could you go into what what did COVID-19 and how much of the inequities that COVID-19 exposed the so-called most powerful country in the world to the rest of the world?
Well, so one way to think about this, right, is what's called Cancer Alley, this place that is in Louisiana, where for at least 30 years there have been a bunch of power plants there, and this area is predominantly Black and disproportionately made up of racialized people. And it's called Cancer Alley because these people tend to get cancer at a disproportionate rate compared to the rest of the country because of their exposure to all these toxic chemicals. Now, this very area is also contracting COVID-19 at an exorbitant rate as compared to the rest of the country. And so what that conveys is that places that have been subjected to environmental racism, to things like food deserts, to things like lack of access to transportation, lack of access to healthcare, these are the places that are being most heavily hit. And these dispossessed areas tend to be areas where racialized people, especially Black people, are. And so there was a study, for example, in Chicago, where that compared the infections in Inglewood to infections in Hyde Park. And the Inglewood is where there's a lot of a concentration of racialized people, Black people in particular, and a concentration of poverty. Hyde Park is a more affluent area, and it was about twice the rate of infections of COVID-19, and an even higher prevalence of death from COVID-19. So essentially what we see is that the ways in which racism in the healthcare system, environmental racism, and disinvestment affect or have impacted Black communities, COVID-19 is just exacerbating these realities. And this is important to note because persons are demanding, that there's this vaccine, right? There's two vaccines now that are supposed to be, or one that has been rolled out, one of that will be rolled out soon, or maybe it has officially been rolled out. And everybody thinks that this vaccine is a magic bullet and that we'll go back to normal after we develop herd immunity. But that back to normal is a situation of gig economy. Right. It is a situation of high unemployment. It is a situation of structural unemployment for a large majority of the Black community. It is a situation of precarious housing, which now is going to result in massive houselessness. And so the only thing that COVID-19 did was exacerbate and accelerate and heighten those contradictions that were already there. And so what it requires is for us to rethink what that normal we're trying to go back to is when people are working, they're engaging in more and more flexibilized labor, insecure labor, informal labor, these forms of work that don't afford health care, that don't afford any type of social safety net. And this is what we're trying to go back to. And so what COVID-19 presents is an opportunity to really do something different theoretically. But as Biden has shown, right, as Congress has shown, they are very, very unwilling to do anything that is transformative. If they're trying to simply implement stopgap measures for ordinary people while they're pumping billions and trillions of dollars into the stock market. And so it's business, COVID-19 has, it's business as usual, but it's just on a heightened scale.
But Dr. Burton Stelly, Trump said that he did more for black people than any other president before him. That's what he said. And I don't understand how, if Trump was able to perpetuate an unemployment rate among black people that was the lowest that it's ever been, that black people are still disproportionately affected by the COVID-19. And I'm having a really hard time maintaining that sarcasm, because it just this whole year, Dr. Burton Stelly, I have been so just enraged by people. I know people are like, she always angry, so that ain't nothing new. But in particular, this people swallowing this whole lie that this man propped up, along with the Department of Labor and their bullshit statistics. It's our show. We can cuss. There you go. So,
finally, freedom.
I wanted to be the first so that you didn't feel bad if you felt it rising up. So, the Department of Labor statistics is in on this grift of misreporting unemployment numbers. And they have been for decades. They just don't tell the truth about the way they report unemployment numbers. Now, this was a big deal with conservatives under Obama, and we're not standing for Obama right now. We're just pointing out the criticism that was leveled against Obama when his administration reported, look, unemployment is going down. And what did the mostly white conservatives say? Well, the Department of Labor Statistics isn't reporting all the numbers on the people who are the long-term unemployed, the gig unemployed, the part-time workers, and the people who have dropped out of the employment market. I don't know why all of a sudden in 2016 those criticisms were not true about this historically low unemployment rate. But I'm wondering how you have been responding to people's propensity to look at what Trump has said. Because I feel like, and we had this conversation earlier, because you were like, well, we have to talk about Trump. And I'm like, no, the fuck we don't. So, because these are not Trump problems, but I recognize that people's focus is on him because, he's the latest boogeyman, and he was very uncivil about his stuff. But this idea of Trump's narrative about doing so much for black people and the opportunity zones that he set up and the
black czar that he put in place that wound up getting fired.
Who
Omarosa, the black czar.
Oh, why you bring up?
I forgot about her.
Yeah, she was the black czar. Remember?
Oh my God, that just brings up a whole another bunch of questions that are not polite at all. But I mean, in the context of COVID-19 and the way black people and indigenous people and people at the bottom of society are faring, before this virus hit, how have you been responding to the way people just kind of believed what Trump said about, how low, and by people, I do mean African people. I do mean black folks. I'm not talking about white folks, and I'm not talking about people who feed on a diet of MSNBC and Rachel Maddow and them. No,
talking about homegrown folks.
I'm talking about us who live around people who we know those numbers can't be right, but some folks are like, well, maybe he's doing a little something. I don't know. That got under my skin this year, but I'm wondering if you noticed that and how you were feeling about that.
I mean, I personally have not encountered very many of those folks. And maybe it's because I'm just around, the niggerati, as we call them. So the black academics who think Trump is just aberrant and or abhorrent that is, and who would never have anything positive to say about him. But I do think that sometimes I think that our people just want to win. We just want to win sometimes, and so we're willing to believe and to go along and get along. I'm kind of thinking about the contract with America, for example, and Ice Cube, the leader of us Black people, apparently, meeting with Donald Trump after Joe Biden refused to meet with him. And just the ways that, and also, Lil Wayne, so the doyens of Black political leadership, right, meeting with Trump. And, the ways that, we have been so dispossessed and so sort of left out of any consideration of what it means for the nation to progress, that, there are particular groups who will believe the hype. To me, though, those Blacks are no different than the ones who believe in Biden. So we can sit here and we can, chastise the ones that believe in Trump, but the ones who believe that Biden is going to be substantively different than Trump, who is going to do something other than polish the turd and be more kind and be more polite with the oppression and with the exploitation, those people, I mean, they are no better than those who believe the Trump lies, those who believe the quote unquote fake news. So I think that anybody who continues to believe in the two-party system, who continues to believe that in lesser of two evilism, or who believes in the quote unquote hold their feet to the fire, it's absurd. It is ridiculous. And so I think that until we being the left, the Black radical left, provide a viable alternative, our people are susceptible to believing all of this electoral hokum.
But what 2020 has really shown us is the fact that there are definitely some real life consequences moving forward, even with the disparities that we see. Mm-hmm. For example, I read an article about virtual education. And so we know that ever since this whole virtual education thing came up with the onset of the pandemic, we knew that our children were at a disadvantage from the beginning. I mean, not having the proper equipment, the way that our families are now structured, based upon the economic distresses that we are in. So a lot of children couldn't even get online. And so I read this article where it says that more wealthier parents, they want to keep the virtual teaching going on because they benefit more. They get better services. I think that this is something that I would like all three of you guys to take a shot at. Number one is the fact that we know that moving forward, our kids are already at a disadvantage when it comes to education in the age of this virtual learning. Also, now you have school systems that are really talking about giving these kids in the so-called underserved areas the new computer equipment. Now, I'm concerned about, and I'm glad we have John here. I'm concerned about the expanded surveillance state.
Extremely.
Right.
Yeah.
As opposed to giving our kids all of this technology. But again, does this actually strengthen the surveillance state? And so as we move forward with the gig economy, everything, we know that economically, racialized people, and I like that, Dr. Stelling, I'm going to start using that racialized people are at the bottom of all of this. And we have eviction crisis going on. So we already, before the pandemic, we already knew that African Americans were approaching zero wealth. Mm-hmm. We already knew this. Mm-hmm. Now we have the pandemic. Now we have this thing where our kids aren't really are being even put under the being less educated now than they were before, and all these other problems with education and school choice and everything. So I want to just throw this ball of whatever I put together at you guys, and if you, Dr. Stelly, can begin, and then you guys can pass it around. But I'm more interested in this, in where we're going with this virtual education, as opposed, because I think it's just more on strengthening the surveillance state, if I may say so.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a real conundrum because, as we know, the school to prison pipeline with respect to Black girls and boys is real. And the ways in which students were being punished with debt, so like the school lunch debt, for example, that's real. And so it seems like it's just passing one form of debt and punishment. It is moving that to the home space. And it seems to me that our children were being miseducated, to use the term of Carter G. Woodson, and left behind, even with in-person instruction. And so I think that, to your point, yes, I do think that it increases surveillance, and it also increases our reliance upon technology, which is a different type of problem. But I wonder if it also presents an opportunity for building alternative education models for our children, so that they can be educated well in terms of curriculum, in terms of pedagogy, in terms of cultural orientation, as well as in terms of having a particular, being sort of, the other thing too, right, is that like 90% of public school teachers are white women. Right. And I don't know. So I think that the education system in general is problematic. And it seems like there's a different set of problems that are presented if we stay online. But I do think that the one big impact is the socialization. That part of K through 12 education is the socialization with other children, developing particular types of social skills. And I think that you cannot replicate that with online learning, no matter how much you have people do words with friends or whatever digitally.
Yes, Jamu, you want to take on?
This is. This is. I mean, we're facing a real crisis, and you all started the show with in January with the impeachment of Donald Trump. This crisis we are facing now is one of the major issues that has emerged in 2020. The beyond the Trump impeachment, this COVID situation that has fundamentally changed so many different things in this country, yes, including this education question. And I'm really concerned about this because, part of the consequence of COVID and the disruption of the economy is that now you have facing many states and local governments across the country a real fiscal crisis. So one of the ways in which they will begin to look at how they can cut corners, cut back, impose austerity will be looking at educational budgets. And it plays right into the hands of the neoliberal agenda to convince people, even people who don't have the means to really do it, and convince people whose children, like our children, are falling behind as a consequence of this mode of instruction, that it makes sense to continue with this kind of so-called virtual learning. But the evidence is starting to emerge that for our children, for other racialized people, colonized people in the U.S., and working class in general, that these kids are falling further and further behind. And there's so many elements to this that we don't talk about. The fact that, for example, the kids are supposed to be taking instruction during the course of the day, but there's an assumption that there will always be an adult in the house overseeing that process.
Right.
where for many of our folks, that ain't really happening.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole lot of teachers who understand their students and who are not going to bust people, but they know that these kids are at home by themselves because, I would say mom and dad, but, in most cases now, is mom who is at home who has to go to work and leaving, maybe the 12-year-old in charge of the other two kids, And so it's a real crisis that we are facing, real social crisis that we are facing as a consequence of this COVID and the inability of the state to really address the real needs of the people. So, this educational crisis is just one aspect of the general crisis that we are going to be dealing with going forward, coming out of 2020. That from COVID to militarism, to the real commitment we know is coming down the pipe to more intensified police repression and war. These are the stories that emerged in 2020 that we are going to have to deal with in 2021 and going further. I mean, I'm really concerned about this whole educational situation.
Yes, yeah.
The teacher shortage that we know is coming also because teachers are leaving the profession.
Mm-hmm.
We got to figure this thing out.
And you know what, John, the issue of the surveillance state in education in particular, Dr. Bertoncelli raised a great point that I hadn't even thought of that I think is a really, really important point, because the expansion of the surveillance state itself is a huge, huge issue and was a huge issue in 2020 in regard to impeachment and this whole FISA court business that people, I don't think, understood how serious it was, what the FISA court did and what it meant to the failure of the impeachment, why the impeachment failed, but also what it meant in regard to another example of the lengths that American intelligence agencies will go to pin something on you if they want you bad enough. But then this issue, John, of the expanding intelligence or surveillance state in education in particular. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or insights on that, and especially as I'm thinking of like Betsy DeVos and the school choice and school privatization push, and the push to get people to go back to school during a pandemic with no policies to support retrofitting classrooms for safety and those kinds of things. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, John.
I'm certainly not the expert that Dr. Bertoncelli and Ajamu Baraka are, but I have a couple of thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, they're absolutely right. Disadvantaged communities, especially Black communities and Native American communities in the United States, are further disadvantaged because of COVID. How do we even begin to assume, for example, that poor people have ready access to the internet? Even if their schools have the money and the wherewithal to provide iPads, let's say, or laptop computers, are we supposed to assume that all poor people have internet access? They clearly don't. Socialization is another thing. Kids learn from other kids. You learn to socialize, you learn to grow, you learn respect, you learn all these different life skills when you're with other people, not sitting, in the lobby of your building because that's the only place you can catch an internet signal. So I think that this is a double whammy against poor people, this terrible COVID outbreak, and it's going to set them back even further. Betsy DeVos set education back half a generation in just the last 4 years. And look at what's happening in places like Kansas, for example, where teachers are paid so little that they have fully 25% turnover, and those teachers in Kansas are resigning and moving to neighboring states because the pay and benefits are so much better. But then there's the issue of the surveillance state, which I think is so important. The deep state is real. You don't have to call it the deep state. You can call it the federal bureaucracy, right?
You can call it the government.
Yeah, call it the government, the state. The truth is that these are the people that make the government run from day to day. And they know that if they don't like a president or they don't like a president's policies, they just outweight that president. Because these people are in positions of authority for 20, 25, 30 years, sometimes longer. And presidents come and go during that period. And they know that when this president goes and the next president goes, they're still going to be in charge. And so that's why we've seen this constant expansion of the surveillance state, because there's literally no authority to stop them. Just last week, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee finally came out and said, after all these years, that what Ed Snowden told us in the summer of 2013 was true. And what NSA was doing with warrantless wiretapping, warrantless surveillance, was illegal. And nobody's done anything to stop that.
I mean, I'm glad you brought up the wiretapping issue, because we got to talk about this FISA court issue, because I feel like the FISA court warrant that was the that was the foundation of the downfall. Well, maybe not the foundation, because when we're talking about impeachment, and I know we're kind of all over the place with a lot of these topics, folks, but I think that's the point. Everything that has happened in 2020 has seemed so unconnected and random, and it was just another, oh my God, what is going on?
Really chaotic.
So chaotic. But, we're not here to say that all of this was by design. There's not, there's nobody, COVID was not created to create all of this chaos. Please, God, don't anybody put that in the chat. Please don't. But the response, the U.S. government response to these events, the Trump administration for some things and the Democrats for other things, and the Democrats in relation to this impeachment in particular, is indicative of how interrelated, interconnected, and how all of this impacted all of us, and it all will in 2021. And we talked about, John, in the context of impeachment. We're not going to sit here and go over, all the stupid reasons that the Democrats went after. This is just ridiculous. But the issue with the FISA court warrant in particular, I think, was really interesting, because nobody really in corporate media interrogated it for what it really was. And we talked about that on Loud and Clear. We talked about it on our show. So explain to people why this FISA court warrant issue was a bigger issue in 2020 than people made it out to be, and why we should be really, really clear on how it's going to impact everything going forward.
Well, just to give our viewers and listeners an idea of what a FISA court warrant is. The FISA court is the Foreign Intelligence Court. So if there is a purported threat to the national security, let's say NSA picks up some chatter, the CIA or NSA would go to the FISA court and get a warrant to tap that line. Maybe there's a known terrorist number calling a number in the United States. You go and you get the warrant. That wasn't the case with the impeachment. The case with the impeachment was there was a rumor that maybe possibly somebody who was associated with the Trump campaign might have been in the process of being developed by the Russian intelligence services. Maybe, maybe not. They went and got their warrant. Well, listen to this. Over the 33-year period of the existence of the FISA court, the court has granted 33,900 942 warrants, and it's denied 12. Now, that is a denial rate of 0.03%. Now, the reason why that happens is because if you are the subject of that FISA warrant, you don't have any idea that they're talking about you in this secret court that's on the top floor of the Justice Department. Not only do you not know it, but you don't have any representation. You know, even if it's kept from you, your attorney's not even allowed to know that you're the subject of this warrant.
Wow.
And so we had these rumors that were picked up by the Australian ambassador to the United Kingdom after a conversation in a bar with George Papadopoulos that led to a FISA warrant being issued and then renewed 3 times, despite the fact that there was literally no evidence that anybody had been involved with the Russians. Well, if there's no way to curb overreach in the FISA court, then what's to keep it from overreaching? And the answer is nothing. Nothing. You don't have any rights in front of that court. You don't have any recourse if the court is doing something about you, tapping your phones, intercepting your emails, putting surveillance teams on you, because you don't have any idea that you're under the microscope.
Well, you know, going to Dr. Burton Stelly, there's another thing that, as we come to the close, it's at 8:15. We didn't want to keep you guys for so long. But one of the things that 2020 has left us with is a more polarized society than we probably have known in recent years. So let's look at this. Even though Donald Trump lost the presidency, 70 million people voted for this man. There's an article that I read today where he was voted on a poll the most admired man of 2020. You know, so we began this year with impeachment, where, you know, it was so much of wanting to get rid of Trump, and yet we end this year with Trump in a better position than he was in than when he first started. So we began with Trump and we end with Trumpism. You know, so this is what I'm seeing. So when we talk about polarization, and I had a lot of people say to me, well, if we just reach out to the megas, I mean, they're poor working class. We look at the long lines in Texas of mainly Trump supporters at food banks and getting donated food. Yet ideologically, they don't see themselves as the same as the rest of us who are poor and working class. My point being is, what is the future of Trump? And I want to say something about the Black Lives Matter too. Yeah. One of the things that we know that this was a year for Black Lives Matter, and rightfully so. But even within the struggle for Black lives and Black rights and Black self-determination, there's even polarization within that. I mean, here we have ADOS. You know, we have the African Descendants of Slaves movement. And so we have BLM. And so we still have these this polarization within the society that even if we think we're moving in the direction, it still allows the powerful elite to maintain their position, because a house divided cannot stand. So I just give this to the panel, to each one of you, and to answer this. We started with Trump, and then we ended with Trumpism. So whoever wants to take that. I say,
I mean, I think, the rise of Trumpism, if you will, was a response to Barack Obama, right? Not Barack Obama doing anything for Black people, but rather the fact that he is a Black president, and there's a perception, right, that him being president somehow menaces the station of white people, which did not, right? It did not improve the conditions of Black people, nor did it menace the position of white folks overall. And I think, again, as we see, perhaps one of the reasons why we can see Trump being considered the most admired man is because of the way he really clamped down on these Black Lives Matter protests. Right? He represented a particular disdain and cruelty and violence against Black people, not only just Black people, but also poor people, also anti-racist people who were really struggling and who really had momentum to enact a particular type of change in society. And I think that people who have a perpetual fear of any sort of Black ascent, of any Black flourishing, really feel represented by Trump's repression of those movements, Trump's defense of property over Black life, right? So I don't think that we can discount that. I think that there are many other factors. I do think that, as we know, in times of economic crisis, fascism or right-wing populism tends to rise to the fore. But I think that especially, progressives and those on the left really do not confront white supremacy.
Right.
Like, we cannot get around that fact. There's always this idea that, white people are voting against their interests. Like I said this morning, white supremacy is one of the interests. Sure, it's against their economic interests, but this idea that they, so for example, most people want universal health care, right, across the racial spectrum. But a certain group do not want other people to have universal. So it's a truncated universalism. So it's one thing to want it for yourself, but oftentimes the other side to that is that you don't want other undesirables to have it. You don't want Black people to have it. You don't want immigrants to have it. You don't want other marginalized communities to have it. And you would rather have those people not have it than you have it yourself. And that, as backward as that logic may seem, that is the politics of white supremacy. And I think that until we actually take this seriously, until we take the white nationalist revanchism seriously, until we take the fact that this is an ideology that has permeated all levels of, or that structures all levels of society, but that is coming back in stunning fashion, until we actually confront that, I think that, the polarization will persist. I'm not gonna touch the 806 thing. I kicked that to Dr. Baraka.
All right,
Dr. Baraka.
Let's
come on now. Let's come with it.
Come on down.
Well, these are really, really complicated issues that we have to deal with, and we have to. I think the way you framed this was really interesting. That the year started with the impeachment of Trump, and ending with what is quite clearly a potentially very powerful political movement that is, I think, was valid to refer to it as Trumpism. And Trumpism now is going to be even more dangerous than it was when Trump was sitting in the White House, because that base of support was, why there was a lot of theatrics, and we all focus on Trump and his vile rhetoric, and we talked about neo-fascism and mixing up fascism with manifestation of certain kinds of authoritarianism, while at the same time the real neo-fascists were strengthening the ideological conformity in this country. But now that he's out of power, out of the White House, that is,
right,
that element is going to become more dangerous, because they are beginning to gel into a real coherent political opposition, and they are dealing with some very dangerous sort of themes. When CNN and MSNBC talk about the Trump forces and what they're talking about on Fox News, and how outrageous it is that they are questioning the election results, and that everybody's angry over there. Well, when you look at what they in fact are debating and talking about at Fox News and in right-wing radio circles, and not just the election, they have a whole narrative that is the base of their grievance.
Right.
That from the very beginning, the liberal elites denied Trump legitimacy. That they targeted his administration, and it goes back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago. Even during the campaign, one of the other stories that the liberals and even these fake ass radicals didn't deal with was the fact that they were engaged in illegal activity in surveilling this man's campaign.
Right.
And the collaboration between the FBI and the CIA and other elements within the intelligence agency was something that was probably the most dangerous that I think I've ever seen. And there was lessons there that we needed to look at and to study in terms of how they use state power to undermine their own democratic process. Trump won the election, but they were not going to allow him to, in fact, govern. I raised the question to folks, what do you think would have been the result of the ruling class if a Bernie Sanders would have got the nomination and would have won?
Wow.
You know, what we see even with Trump was just will pale in comparison. If a Bernie Sanders, the one thing that Trump had going for him was that he unlike Barack Obama, who wasn't interested in any kind of populist movement. When they told Barack Obama to put up his cell phone, he did that. But their objective was to demobilize their base. Trump understood that the way he was going to survive, he had to keep his base mobilized. Right. And that's what kept him in power. So, you know, this situation is very, very dangerous because the state has, right on front of our faces, shown their hand that they are the willing instruments of a ruling class that would do everything in its power to ensure that there's no real change in this country at all. We saw that how they collaborated to undermine Corbyn in the UK, and how they collaborated to undermine and do away with Sanders, and how they kept the Trump administration for almost 2 years from being able to govern until Trump did a very slick kind of triage. You know, he gave them the tax cut. He gave the neoliberal ruling element, who was situated within the military-industrial complex, you know, record budgets. He made a case for why there needs to be a pivot to China, and so by 2018, going to 2019, basically he was sitting pretty. I mean, he had basically demonstrated that he wasn't going to be the disruptive force in terms of challenging the neoliberal global agenda that they thought he was going to be.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And they don't care about him being a racist and all of that. They don't care about that. All they were cared about was him undermining the neoliberal architecture that they had put in place over the last 40 years. And he showed that he wasn't going to do that. He didn't really deliver much for his base economically, including, you know, the petty bourgeoisie, the bigger nationalist capitalists. They were his supporters. He didn't really get afraid about that base until COVID,
right.
Because it was his base. It was that base, the small business people, you know, the mid-sized business and large nationally based business that was being impacted by COVID. And he knew that was a real issue for him, and he was in trouble. And he mishandled that in so many different ways. But my last quick point, what's interesting about this whole Trump phenomenon too, is how we get fixated on this Trump person, this Trump, the personality, even to the extent that we attribute things to Trump that Trump didn't have a whole lot to do with. Like, for example, we kind of, talk about, what happened with the uprisings and all of that. We got to remember that, the response to the protests and all that, these were local issues, and they were happening primarily in cities controlled by Democrats and Black Democrats on top of that.
Right.
Okay. Now Trump baited folks into confrontations like in Portland, and he threatened to send the Department of Homeland Security elements to other cities. He was just BS. He was just bullshitting. Okay. But he did what he wanted to do. He baited them into that confrontation in Portland. Okay. In some kind of way, it got spun that the whole thing was about Trump.
Right.
Well, it wasn't about Trump.
Right.
And so this fixation on Trump, moved us away from keeping the focus on the system, the structures, the institutions, the continuity of the state. And that's why it was easy for the Biden and the neoliberal white supremacists to mobilize folks in order to win back the White House. Something they weren't interested in at the beginning of this year. We didn't get a chance to talk about this during this conversation, but the whole election process, the main objective of the Democratic Party at the beginning of this year had nothing to do with the White House. They'd already conceded that Trump was going to win just before the real COVID thing kicked in. Everybody knew Trump was on his way to a second term. Okay. We talk about the unemployment stats and all of that. Yeah, of course, it was somewhat cooked, but the objective fact was they could claim the lowest unemployment rates in the last 60 years. Okay, so he was on his way until that COVID thing undermined him. So, they when that happened, then the Democrats discovered, we might in fact be able to win the White House. Their main objective, and I'm closing now, was stopping Sanders. So, these are some complicated issues, and Trump is not going away. In fact, he has more influence, and it's a very dangerous situation we face in this country because we have no effective organized opposition to what is going to unfold, not only with Trumpism, but also with the intensification of repression that we know is coming down the pipe from the Biden forces.
Well, I mean, we're out of time, but I don't want to. I want to give John an opportunity to give his input on this subject matter, and then Jackie, we'll go to our chat. Our chat is, as Dr. Ball said earlier, the chat is blowing up. So we want to see if there's any.
If you all don't have a problem hanging around for another 10 minutes or so, we would. Cool. Yeah, that's great because we. You know how we do. We can sit here for 2 hours.
Right.
You don't want to do that, but But we don't want to do that. But John.
Yeah.
I'll make a very short point. Of course, everything that Ajamu told us is exactly true. And at the same time, we've watched the Democratic Party move farther and farther to the right. Where people who call themselves progressives today were relatively conservative or right of center Democrats 30 and 40 years ago. And so most of my friends, at least who are truly progressive, don't really consider themselves to be Democrats anymore. They're Greens, they're Democratic Socialists, they're independent leftists. But the Democratic Party has moved so far to the right that there really isn't a home anymore for true progressives, not at least in the two main parties.
Right. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, what you all just said about all of these issues that we raised, and why they're important to talk about in the same conversation, in the same context, because they are related and they are a representation of a couple of things. Just like Ajamu said, the continuity of the state and the intention of the state to perpetuate its continuity regardless of who is in power. I think part of this is, the terrible strategy of the Democratic Party in continuing to completely ignore the people and the people in its own party to move it slightly left of center right where it is, to somewhere a little bit more humane, and to do that in service of the same system and same state. And just the fact that, yes, Donald Trump is, he's a cartoon villain. He's absolutely like the guy who,
Snarly Whiplash.
Yeah, Snarly. He's absolutely like the Snarly Whiplash of politics. Yeah, he is. But he is not the villain. There is, I hate to say it because it sounds a little conspiratorial, a man behind a curtain, but the curtain is the system.
Yeah, he's like a walking Thomas Nash cartoon.
Yeah. And I mean, when this year started, actually, it was probably like 2018 when things really started to go crazy with Trump. We were saying on our show, look, I don't care what happens with the rest of this man's administration, Donald Trump is probably the best thing that could have happened to this country. He had to happen. There was, first of all, he was inevitable because of the way this country has conducted itself, what it is. But also, I don't think we'd be having these conversations about FISA warrants, John, and about, Arab countries and African countries aligning themselves with Israel. And we didn't even get to the conversation about silencing dissent when we're talking about standing up for Palestinians in the media and in academia. We didn't even get to that conversation. I don't think we'd be having these conversations interconnectedly if there were not the person of Donald Trump that kind of made it possible for all of these things to happen in the same administration with the kind of attention that they were given, because they had always been happening, but people didn't really care because it's just those crazy activists causing trouble. But when everybody made all of these things about Trump, then it was like this new horror that was supposedly going on. And I agree with the Jamu. These are conversations, there were lessons that we should have been learning about these things, but I think because they have been so complex, and as Dr. Burton Stelly said earlier, the United States, we don't do history well. We have not been very good at having these conversations. But that's where political education comes in, and that's what we think is a part of our job. But the last couple of minutes, you all, thank you so much for your comments. Tanya Nixon Silberg said earlier, we were talking about communism. She said over 100 years of anti-communist and anti-Soviet Russian propaganda from the power elite make it appear tenable to masses of people. I mean, do you all disagree with that? That it's just the consistency over a century of the anti-communist ideology that's come from this government that just makes it like whenever somebody says, oh, the Russians did it and the evil commies, then people in this country are like, yeah, that's them. They're the problem.
Yep.
I think that's right.
You go back to the Alien and Sedition Act, 1798. Then prior to anti-communism, there was the anti-socialism and the attack on Germans, and the attack on anarchists, and the attack on labor organizers in the 1850s and 1870s. So it's a long, long history of anti-radicalism. It's endemic in the U.S. state, right? Look at the Alien and Sedition Acts and look at what they were trying to control and what they were trying to repress. That's 1798. That's like a decade after the American Counter-Revolution.
Well, yeah, and we also remember too that this recent COVID package, they had something about illegal streaming and
yeah, and the threat to that unless Section 230 is done away with, then we can't get our own money back. I mean, just the connection of these issues. I mean, does anybody want to address the whole Section 230 business? Because I don't think people understand what that is and why that matters.
But Jacqueline, I'm curious about you were saying how because we can't see the chats from here. But I'm curious about what are some of the things coming up in the chats that we might need to deal with these last few minutes. I'm curious about that.
Yeah, the one was about the Facebook, Twitter, YouTube blocking articles that don't confirm mainstream propaganda. Let's see.
Is there any questions in there?
Yeah, there. Alex asked. This isn't interesting. Any opinions on the movement for a People's Party versus the more classic Party for Socialism and Liberation? And I feel like this is a question about ideology. Like, Ajamu, how do we here in this movement parse through ideology of these different political groups? If we're trying to form a movement to challenge the system, what do we do with these different ideologies of these different political groups? How do people parse through the ideology of a movement for a People's Party versus the Party for Socialism and Liberation?
Well, I mean, I think people have to look at their ideological orientations and make informed decisions based on that. There's a fundamental difference between the Party for Socialism and Liberation versus the other party, and so one has to make a determination what appears to what positions and what postures they have that appear to make sense to you, that appears to reflect the kind of reality as you understand it, and the kind of solutions that you believe need to be arrived at, and make those kinds of decisions. But there's no other way of getting around that. We have these different ideological orientations, different kinds of political tendencies, and people have to make informed choices. But that's why it's so vitally important that we do have informed, politically astute people, so that you can make those kinds of determinations. You could determine what organization you might want to affiliate with and be a part of. What's the better way of seeing the world, and what should be our ultimate objectives? Because that's what we have to talk about too. Where are we going? We could talk a whole lot about all of the issues we are facing, but what is the vision? What is our understanding of the possibilities of us as human beings? How do we see societies being organized to reflect our potentiality as human beings? Where are we going? And those kinds of conversations we have to have also, because we have to have a vision. We can't organize our people just based on we catching hell.
Right.
We've got to be able to show people and suggest to people that we can be more than what we are today, that we can transform our conditions, that we can build a new society and indeed a new world. If that's part of the battle of ideals that we are involved in, we are motivated not out of anger, we're motivated out of love, out of a commitment that we can in fact be more than what we are, that we can live in harmony with other people and with the earth. So we've got to talk about those kinds of visions also, because that's what's going to sustain a revolutionary movement.
And that's one of the things that we do plan on doing in the near future. We always invite you guys to come back to help us with that conversation. But someone in the chat, Ajama, was thinking along the lines that you were thinking, and they said there was once, and I'm paraphrasing, but they said, there was a time in the civil rights movement where our situation here as black people were taken to the international court. What can we do to make rising powers like China and other rising powers in the 21st, in this going into 2021? How can we use that leverage with these other rising powerful countries to help us with our international struggle?
I defer that to Dr. Burton-Stelly. She's been doing outstanding research on these issues that we've been involved in around peace, human rights, internationalizing our struggle. So,
Dr. Burton-Stelly?
Well, I think that, yes, so there is a long history of bringing, since the formation of the United Nations, there has been a history of bringing our struggles before that body. There was the National Negro Congress, the petition, the NAACP under the leadership of W.B. Du Bois presented a petition, as did the Civil Rights Congress. We charged genocide aside from that, when the Organization of African Unity was formed, one of the first things that they did was issue a statement against the treatment of African Americans in the United States. The context of tricontinentalism, of third worldism, and the new international economic order, these sort of multi-ethnic, transcontinental forms of solidarity are really important, because though it wasn't both the Soviet Union and China, but also the non-aligned movement, like the Afro-Asian solidarity, all of these blocks provide counterweight to the United States. We don't necessarily have that same counterweight currently, because even as China is a counterweight to the United States economically, but it does not provide the same ideological counterweight that the Soviet Union did, or that Cuba or Vietnam or these other sort of international blocks. So I think that it absolutely would be the case if the Organization of American States, if the African Union and these other multinational bodies issued a statement on behalf of not only struggles in the United States, but on behalf of other struggles like in SARS, et cetera. I think that we do need to re-galvanize that international solidarity, because the United States has always been pushed to implement change. It will never do so of its own accord. And if there is no ideological and no sort of political counterweight, there is no incentive to do it. And it becomes even more important as I've said elsewhere, as U.S. imperialism reaches its asymptote, all of that violence is going to come to bear on the domestic population. And so we're going to need international allyship, whether it's Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, wherever it comes from, even China. I think that's absolutely vital. And I think that we can, Dr. Baraka, I don't know why he punted this one, but he talks about people-centered human rights. This is something that applies to everybody wherever we are located, right? And I understand people need simply the liberation for Black people and oppressed people. And so I think that we absolutely need to revive that transcontinental internationalist solidarity if we're going to stand a chance.
All right, thank you, guys.
This thing.
Well, thank you, guys. We're coming down to the end of our time, and we thank you for joining us, and we will definitely invite you back if you would come back to help us further this conversation, as Ajamu so eloquently said. So before we go, Dr. Cherie, since we have you, how can our listeners and viewers get in touch with you and see your the work that you're doing?
You know what?
There we
Black
go.
Alliance for Peace. Black Alliance for Peace. That's the organization we all need to mobilize. I don't know, PSL, whatever now.
Okay, Black Alliance.
BAP, Black Alliance for Peace.
You got
it. Catch me there. Yeah.
All right.
And John, what about you? You've we know what happened with Loud and Clear. We've been wondering what's going on with you. What have you been doing? And where can people, because you've been writing, where can people connect with you?
At johnkiriakou.com. I'm also on Facebook and Twitter, and I'm writing regularly for Consortium News and Reader Supported News.
Great.
Thank you.
And Ajamu Baraka from the 24th Dimension. We throw out these inside jokes with our friends all the time on our streams, and people are like, what are they talking about? But that's one of the inside jokes we have with our brother Ajamu Baraka. How can people connect with you and support the work that needs to be done and that is being done?
Well, I would echo what Dr. Burton Stelling just said, that if you don't have an organizational home and you believe that we have to build a movement that connects up our struggles in the U.S. with our struggles against U.S. imperialism, then you might want to consider the Black Alliance for Peace. You can join either as a member, or if you are a non-African, you can join as a supporter. And we look to and look for both of those categories. You can also, I've been told to keep to do this, but I'm on Twitter. So it's at Ajamu Baraka. So it sounds so funny to say follow me, but that's where I'm at.
Well, listen, you all, thank you all so much for joining us on this very, very wide-ranging conversation tonight. We hope that for our viewers, for those of you in the chat, y'all raised some great questions, and for those who will watch later on, we hope that we made some connections to some of these issues that we thought we were blindsided with this year, but they're all part of this massive, this long ongoing struggle that we are engaged in for liberation in this country. And our struggle for liberation in this country is inextricably tied for the struggle for liberation of people around the world. So this is one conversation. I hope that we will continue to have many, because the struggle continues. We can't stop talking about these issues just because we think the boogeyman that we believe caused them will be gone, because that's not the case at all. So,
and you know, and you folks out there know why we're the most dangerous show on social media. The most dangerous. You ain't gonna find them more dangerous.
It's not just because of Mrs. Lukman's cussing. That's So thank you all so much. We appreciate you very much. As always, share this video. Subscribe to us on YouTube. Follow us on Twitter. And like us on Facebook. And as always, we've been saying this ever since we've been on this show, but it means so much more now.
Brother Fred Hampton.
He said, peace if you are willing to fight for it. We got to fight for it now. Right. Peace, y'all.
That's right. No compromise, no retreat.
No retreat. You. Africa must be free.
Yes.
Look at our patrons.
To all my haters.
that is the greeting for 2020. That's the greeting for 2021 too. We still here, man.
Hey guys, we appreciate it so much, man. I mean, you guys were awesome. Any mistakes
How they claiming they on top and I'm around love. I know the wall's closing in, but don't you dare give up now. Poe believed in me, pull up, threw some bucks down. Todd told the valet, pull the truck round. Push the line up that we drew it, it's just us now. Would you believe me if I told you my granny told me she prayed this? Then booked the surgery just to pull me out of the basement. Right back where I started.